Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today as we look at standardization and modern slavery and corporate crime. Today we have some terrific speakers lined up, and we'll be introducing them soon. I just wanted to point out that the standards that we have today, Alex Trottrums, Helen Carter, Keith Lewis, and Duncan Jepson, they have been stalwart supporters of the standardization, not just in modern slavery, but in other areas as well, which will be described. So I'm grateful that you're joining us today to hear, but I'm also very, very grateful for those speakers for their ongoing support in standardization. My name is David Adamson. I'm a lead standards manager at British Standards Institution based in Chiswick, London. And next slide, please. And I just wanted to go through a little bit of housekeeping here. As you can see, listen-only webinar. It's being recorded. If you want to get the recording afterwards, if you fill out the feedback form, they'll send you a copy or a link to the recording. There's a survey, always very keen to get your feedback to see what we can improve on. Any difficulties, put it through the Q&A. And questions will be done through the Q&A. So not the chat that some of you might be used to. That's the housekeeping. Next slide, please. Okay, so the agenda today. You've got me. As I say, I'm with British Standards, and I have been for quite a while, 20 years now, and it's quite a privilege to be able to work in this area of standardization, having moved from quality to project management and various other types of standards. But in the area of human rights, sustainability, modern slavery, I'm very pleased to be able to tell you today about the progress we're making in standardization. Professor Trottrums at Nottingham University, he's the next speaker. He's going to introduce one of the standards, 37200 on modern slavery. So I won't really touch on anything now. I'll let him speak on that topic entirely. But I want to, again, express my gratitude to him and the Rights Lab at Nottingham University. Absolutely vital that we had their support as we gathered stakeholders together to try to achieve consensus and produce a set of recommendations in what was what is a challenging area, a sensitive and challenging area. Helen, equally, same thing. She now head of sustainability procurement at Costain. Just done a terrific job when we delve into the standards and you look at what is modern slavery and how to manage the risk of it. You see that procurement, the role it plays, it's critical. It's a key essential element of it. So no one better placed, in my opinion, to speak than Helen. Keith Lewis, I'm very, very grateful for Keith to be able to open up today and tell us his experience as a survivor. So thank you, Keith, in advance for being brave enough to come out and, globally mention what's happened to you and the experiences that you've had, and hopefully some remarks that can give a little bit of positivity. Duncan is got a vast amount of experience in the law, and he's been doing with Preveni, which again is an organization that's provided a terrific amount of support. He and his colleagues at that organization in terms of human rights and criminality and fraud. We'll touch on that. So thank you all. Then we'll have the closing remarks. But first, as you see, you've got me speaking about standards. I thought we should touch on standards. Can we go to the next slide, please? The one with the picture? Okay, this is my scope. So it's 10 minutes or so. So working in the standards environment, because we're talking about, yes, modern slavery or exploitation, it isn't only going to be modern slavery standard we'll talk about, but it's that area. But we are talking standardization, so it's important to have a very basic overview of that before we launch into the subjects: modern slavery and corporate crime, financial crime, and corruption. And then finally, the current and future standardization activities. Next slide, please. So a little bit about BSI. So BSI is the world's oldest standards body, 1901. It began with that group of gentlemen there who were the Engineering Standards Committee. And they gathered to tackle a problem, the tram sizes. They wanted to see that they were uniform. And they did. And the committee evolved over the years, and such that it was given a royal charter in 1929 that certainly helped. And the revision of the royal charter in 1998, it enabled BSI to diversify. It became the BSI group, but that meant that they could acquire organizations. But it's a not-for-profit distributing organization. The headquarters is currently in Chiswick, although they will be moving to central London, Covent Gardens, in the next couple of months. I think that's that slide. That's all I really want to say about BSI. Operates in almost every country. It's quite a network. The way that BSI committees operate, this is a snapshot of the composition of a BSI committee. There's about 1,200 BSI committees. As I mentioned, there's committees on pretty much anything. And if there isn't, we're always interested to hear about possibilities. So it comes from AI now, but previously project management to quality, but also, very, very strong in construction. So, the most common thing people often associate it with is a kite mark. I think it's the most recognized brand in the UK, one of the most recognized brands, if you can imagine that. But you often see it as you're walking down the pavement, and you'll see a cover, a steel cover, and it's got that kite mark. Or if you're at the petrol station, you'll see on the pump the kite mark saying that it conforms to BS so-and-so. So that's what these committees are doing. But here's the composition. We bring together the users, standards, of course, research organizations, academia, and public sector NGOs, education, trade associations, government bodies. And in fact, with government bodies, you'll see that they can really have a huge influence in the sense that if there's a regulation, it makes it much easier to get the takeoff for a new area of work. I put to side with that, with the ISO, the International Standardization Organization. That's obviously a very large body as well. It's based in Geneva. I think they were established in like 1941. But they also started off with a small group in London, I think with 40 countries. And now they've got a standards body for each country. So in the UK, BSI is the national standards body. So NSB is the acronym always used. We always forget to tell people what it is, but every country has one national standards body and only one. So people often use the term standards or protocols, but a standard, there's only one organization per country. CEN is something we also hear about because despite Brexit, there is still conformance to what the regulations or the rules for CEN. This is a European group producing standards, and their significance is if it's produced as an EN, then the UK needs to adopt it. Whereas an ISO, you could have a choice. You could say we have a British standard, we have an ISO standard. They can live side by side. But if you have an EN, and the UK needs to adopt that EN. But those are the groups that come together. It's all voluntary, by the way. If you're interested in participating in a standardization area, in short, go to bsigroup.com, and there's a page, becoming a BSI committee member. And they're very, very good about referring it to the appropriate organization and saying, this might be of interest, and then making the connection. So I would encourage you to do that. Next, please. Okay, so this is my last slide on standards before we go into the subject matter itself. BSI is a facilitator. It guides and steers. That's what we do. The committees will really give the information, the experience, the skill set, whether they're consultants or they're professional organizations or trade associations, they come around the table and they'll say, we're giving our time freely. In fact, we're putting our IP on the table as well, which is a huge thing. And so we want to do something for the better of society. And so here we are. But BSI facilitates that process. We recognize that in globally, there's a huge number of organizations, especially when you look at something like modern slavery. And it's a very important, sensitive topic. And you do see quite a lot of publicity around instances of modern slavery and organizations that are doing really fine work. BSI would love to bring those to the table. ISO would love to bring those to the table. Because when you have BSI, we're bringing together collectively national stakeholders, interested parties. When we go to ISO, we increase that consensus because it's not just one country. I think there's 197 member states for ISO. So as I say, every country pretty much has a standards body. So you can see that ISO is really where we want to be at. So what we just mentioned, that what we've done really successfully through a committee under Alex Trottram was to bring together the stakeholders. We also got international participation now. We started to do that as early as the national work, but I note here the importance of the developing countries. Because one of the benefits of standardization is to help developing countries. Because it may be that in the UK has a Modern Slavery Act 2015, and these things are constantly being revised by very competent groups of people in government as well. That helps tremendously to have the government as well as professional associations. But other countries don't. Others, when we went to ballot with the modern slavery, of course it was sensitive, and we weren't really sure what the result would be. But we turned to our partners in the Caribbean that we've been working with, and they really helped by promoting it and gaining acceptance and support from the Latin American countries. And so currently, BSI partners with St. Lucia. That's what we do. We twin with developing countries and then benefit. They're learning and increasing their understanding of the area. But the synergy is there. We learn from each other, absolutely. Once the standard is published, then the key thing is that it's not on a shelf. There's a lot of standards published. I think for British standards, it's something like 12 or 13,000. And ISO, probably around 20,000. There's a lot of standards. They are being updated. That makes them to be relevant. There's a review every 5 years at least. They have to be looked at as part of a systematic review. And that ensures that, hopefully the lessons learned from it, feedback, taken into account, and you can improve on it. So they don't just sit on a shelf. That's the idea. But we're going to talk a little bit more about determining the impact. BSI is, I think very wisely looked and said, okay, we're producing these standards. We know that blood, sweat, and tears are going into these things. They take a year to 5 years to produce a standard. BSI has done a lot to reduce that time. But so now it's maybe a couple of years, 2 to 3 years, even for an ISO. It still takes that time. And then we don't want it to sit on the shelf. We want it to be used. We want people to understand it. We'd be aware of it, to be able to measure its impact. And it's not necessarily just certification. There's other ways to consider the impact. The King's College, King's Business School, they're doing a terrific job trying to explore this, analyze it, and see not only what is, how we can improve on that. They're also a valuable committee member. So in turn, we look for new standards. My last slide, if you could please move that forward. Doris, if you can move that forward, thanks. This is where I wanted to spend most of my time. But as usual, I've talked a little bit too much on standards. But here we have 3 columns. It's about, when I said exploitation, it includes modern slavery, safeguarding, human rights. And on my screen, I can't quite see the bottom of it, but maybe it's minus violence against women. I'd like to spend the last 5 minutes looking at these closely. So in the exploitation column, in 2020, I think I've got that wrong. No, that's right. 2022, we produced the first guidance standard on modern slavery. We knew that we really wanted it to be an ISO, but sometimes you can't start off with an ISO. You have to be measured in your approach. And that's why the next version was going to be an ISO, and we put the BS in front of it because BSI will adopt it, BS ISO, and the number will be 37200 and the year of publication 26, and it'll be a guide. Similarly, when we were doing that work, somebody came out and says, actually, what about safeguarding, for protecting the individuals against harm? Is it just children or is it vulnerable adults? So it should be both. So you have those discussions. A standard was produced. Very grateful again for one of our committee member groups, Save the Children. They led it and produced 25800. Again, we knew that it would, have the potential, and sure enough, we were able to take it to ISO. It's just gone to ISO, been voted through, and that is underway. It's 37202. A great ambition is the standard BS 30,000 on human rights due diligence. Now you notice the other two standards are guidance standards. In many ways, they're easier to produce because it's not a requirement. So requirement specifies what you need to do in order to demonstrate compliance. So in this group, when they looked at it for about 18 months, and they said, no, we think we can do something, the most appropriate standard we can do as a requirements. And so they produced, or they are producing 30,000. So not due for a little bit more, but they're doing a great job, but they are having their challenges. The last one I can see on my screen is violence against women. It's not always BSI, although BSI do tend to actually initiate a lot of work. As I say, that might be for various reasons, but it's an old standards body, 1901. They got a lot of experience. It's a brilliant model, free for. So there's reasons that BSI does occupy a very solid and important position in the development of standards globally. But in this case, the Brazil ABNT, they said we've listened to all this. We want to put something forward. Violence against women, and interestingly, they put it forward as a requirement. So that's underway. So we got exploitation. I measure those. I call those exploitation. Categorize them as that. Then we got the financial crime, anti-bribery. Notice 2011. Again, legislation sometimes supports this, and that happened. And we have fraud control, and now we have a money laundering. Notice the requirements and guides in there. But I'll finish in the last couple of minutes with what I think the outcomes are. The state, the current state and the future state is that, importantly, we know that in developing these standards for these areas of work, that we want to affect change, positive change, help people improve their lives. That's all standards really want to improve people's lives, whether it's buying a car, or making sure your airplane is reliable, or your bricks and the mortar, or your ensuring quality system. Of course we do, but in this area it's particularly sensitive. I'll give again credit to BSI because they made for the first time a standard for free, and it's very unusual for modern slavery. And I think that really set the tone and the importance that BSI placed on this. The thing that they're doing at ISO, the groups that Alex, Helen, and Keith and Duncan are working on, is they're now making the connection between these two groups. And that's something that I think Duncan in particular is going to touch on. And in the last minute, I say that there is something, when we do standards, we can do guidance that helps raise awareness. We can do requirements, raises awareness, but it's also something very much you can measure against. So, but there's something else that's recently come to the light, and it's in terms of gathering a pool, a community of users, and saying, let's share our information, and let's learn from it. Let's be transparent as much as we can within our disclosure agreements, but let's share it so that we can really have synergize. And I know this has been done before, and especially in the procurement with, I think, 24,000 But we have an opportunity to do that in this area of work as well. And the last thing I'll say is that we do have the opportunity for other standards, other awareness raising activities such as webinars, and we know the impact is global, because now we can see, for instance, with Nigeria, that they're coming forward and they're saying we want to lead the work on fraud, which is terrific. So BSI are going to work with them. So we know we have an impact and want to continue with that. That was a whirlwind, but I'm going to now introduce the next speaker. So with that sort of background, I want to introduce, as I say, a friend as well as a professional, and that is Alex, who's done such a terrific job in developing both the national standard and the international standard. Alex, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dave. Yeah, like Dave said, I'm a professor of supply chain management at the University of Nottingham. So I'm usually based in the business school, but I'm also part of the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab, which is now the world's largest research center on modern slavery. And yeah, what got me really interested as an academic from a research perspective into the topic of modern slavery is that a lot of the way supply chains run, the way we run businesses often actually creates modern slavery risks. And so there's really something that needs to change. And so I've been working on this since about 2014. And part of that was then writing or coordinating the BS 25700, which BSI kindly made available free of charge for those who want to look at that standard document, and now convening ISO 37200, which is for me the first time I'm convening a standard. So thank you, Dave, for guiding us through the world of standardization, which has its own rules and procedures. So why do we need ISO 37200? Why do we need this standard? We know from global estimates by the International Labour Organization and the Walk Free Foundation that there are about 50 million people in the world who live in conditions of modern slavery. And we also know that modern slavery, or human trafficking, which is the process of bringing people into exploitation, bringing people into conditions of slavery, is a highly profitable crime, creating hundreds of billions of profits annually. And the world has, through the Sustainable Development Goals, set itself an agenda to stop modern slavery. And that's within SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. And within that SDG 8 is target 8.7, which is the eradication of modern slavery, forced labor, human trafficking, and the worst forms of child labor. We know that all supply chains in the world are impacted by modern slavery. All of us who are using modern electronics, who are just average consumers in this world, we will all be connected to victims of modern slavery through our consumption of products and services in this world. So despite all supply chains being connected to modern slavery, I also met so many business practitioners over the years. They don't want modern slavery to be part of their supply chains. And so there's this real need to provide them with knowledge and approaches to what they can do to eradicate modern slavery from their supply chains. And more recently, there's been increasingly legislation. Some of you may have heard about, for example, the EU's mandatory human rights due diligence initiative. You may have heard about US forced labor import bans. And this is just kind of my European perspective, but there are other pieces of legislation across the Pacific region and other regions of the world. Brazil, for example, having some very advanced legislation against modern slavery that is increasingly putting pressure on corporations, particularly to act actively against modern slavery risks in their operations and supply chain. You could take me to the next slide, please. So what is ISO 37200 about? we use modern slavery as an umbrella term that includes forced labor, human trafficking, and we've also, as part of the ISO process, also now including the worst forms of child labor within ISO 37200. So when we think of modern slavery, we often think of a continuum of labor exploitation. And so at the good end of things, you would have what we would recognize as decent work. And then you have a spectrum of exploitation, and at the extreme end of that exploitation is modern slavery, forced labor, human trafficking. So these are really extreme, severe situations of exploitation and suffering of individual humans. And so in between those extremes of modern slavery and decent work, you'll have a wide area of different types of exploitation, even though they not necessarily always then hit the legal threshold of modern slavery, but many of the types of exploitation in that spectrum are already very bad working and living conditions. So when we look at the number of 50 million people in the world who are estimated to be in modern slavery, we know the overall problem is much, much bigger than the 50 million number. If you could take me to the next slide, please. Then, so why do we need a standard on managing the risk of modern slavery? Because there's already a standard on risk management. There are other standards that help organizations to manage their compliance obligations and their corporate social responsibility. We need it because modern slavery is very different to other risks, and people often use the phrase around double materiality, because this is not just about protecting the organization. If you really want to address modern slavery effectively, you need to think of this with a primary lens of the risk to individuals, the risk to human beings in the supply chain, and that then informs what you do next. So there's a real importance to understand what are these risk factors in supply chains and individuals and communities that makes them vulnerable to modern slavery. Why is it more likely to find modern slavery in one part of my supply chain than another? And it's really what we want to do with this standard is really providing that knowledge to practitioners, because we recognize many practitioners who will, or most practitioners who will be using this standard are not modern slavery experts, they're not human rights experts, but they may work in corporate governance, in compliance, or they might actually just run a small, medium-sized enterprise. And so we really want to make that expert knowledge accessible to them so they can use it in their organization to help eradicating modern slavery within their reach. As we know that modern slavery is kind of connected to all of our supply chains, we really want to also provide practitioners with an understanding of where and how to prioritize. Because monitoring 100% of all of your supply chains all the times is probably not realistic and would take an incredible amount of resource. So where do we want practitioners to spend their attention and focus their attention and resources first? And a lot of what we know about effective solutions against modern slavery is actually not necessarily in the business community. A lot of it also comes from the other stakeholders that they've mentioned in his presentation. It comes from NGOs, it comes from survivors, other stakeholders. And this is why this approach to standardization that BSI facilitates works so well here, because it brings all these knowledge holders together and everyone is contributing their knowledge to make it accessible for the people who then have to implement solutions in their organizations. Next slide, please. So what have we included in ISO 37200? We have vulnerability factors to help people understand and think about where their organization supply chains are more vulnerable to modern slavery, and where are the people that are more vulnerable to modern slavery in their supply chains. So we really want to help organizations to identify, assess, and evaluate modern slavery risks, but then not just understanding the risk, but taking action. So we identify, assess, and evaluate the risk, but then what do we do with that knowledge? And that is also importantly in the standard. So it's a full risk management approach with very specialist expertise that individuals of the working group contributed. So we got specialist sections on policy, on leadership, governance in the organization, and then probably reflecting the membership of the working group. Also got some very function specific sections on how to operationalize the standards in key corporate functions, particularly recruitment and procurement, and Helen will obviously speak more about procurement. And that's really specialist knowledge to bring that into the standard. We have, throughout the standard, weaved stakeholder engagement into the document, which again is a key tool to understand your risk exposure and you're keeping you on track whether you're doing the right thing. And really appreciate that Keith has been on this committee from the very start, which is really for us as a working group to keep ourselves anchored in why we need this standard and why does it matter. It is in the end individuals who need the support for modern slavery to be mitigated and prevented. And then, of course, also we have a section on what to do if you find instances of modern slavery, so investigation, and then importantly, remediation as well. Next slide, please. So what we want to achieve with ISO 37200 is really is having something that is meaningful and effective. So this is not just about giving organizations a box to tick. It is not that we could have done this way easier and way quicker. It is about bringing together what works, that expert knowledge on what is good practice out there, what do we know works, and making that accessible to practitioners so that when they act against modern slavery, they implement something that we know is meaningful and effective against modern slavery. The beautiful thing of ISO standards is they work for all organizations, so it's sometimes quite difficult in the writing process to constantly think about what about really small organizations and what about really big organizations, because they work very differently. So it needs to work for all organizations, and this is really making this a very harmonized approach. So the standard document works across all industries, all countries, all supply chains, can be adapted by any organization in the world, whether private or public sector. And what we really wanted to bring to them is really this educating people around modern slavery, what are effective solutions, and raising the bar. Because with ISO 37200 then being available very soon, it means that knowledge is out there. And when I started working on modern slavery in 2015 with Helen, for example, who speaks next, we had relatively little advice for practitioners what to do about this topic. And I think we've learned a lot in the last 10 years about managing the risk of modern slavery, and we're bringing that together in this document and making that available. And we hope that supports this raising the bar. And then importantly, it aligns with the normative frameworks in this space from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and the OECD due diligence guidelines for multinational enterprises. So we mapped the document against those frameworks and have found that we actually align quite well with them. And then my last slide, please, is, it's just a thank you slide. Okay, that's keeps me well on time then. So I hope you have the opportunity to either look at BS 25700 or then ISO 37200 when it's published, hopefully in August, September 2026. And with that, I'm handing over to Helen Carter, our next speaker, who is the head of sustainable procurement and supplier relationship management at Costain, and who has been a key contributor to both the British standard and this ISO development. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Alex. I feel I've now known we've known each other for about 10 years. I definitely do. Brilliant, thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Helen Carter, a very long, convoluted title. But basically, I've been in procurement ever since I left university, which was quite a few decades ago. I'd say 20 years of that 30 years has been looking specifically at sustainable procurement, and the last 10 years is the lens further down into modern slavery. And as Alex has said, I've worked in the ISO and the BSI standard. Most of my experience over the last sort of 20 odd years is in the built environment. So if you ever want complex and very opaque supply chains, the built environment is definitely one of those areas where it's a very difficult area. What I'm going to focus on today is looking specifically at why supply chains. Alex has done a little bit of a dive into that for us, but also the role procurement can play as enablers, and also how we can use the standard. Now, I'm a huge advocate of standards in one way, and the reason I love this standard and I love ISO 2400, which is the sustainable procurement standard, is because they're guidance standards. You cannot address modern slavery risks in your organisation and your supply chain by ticking boxes. It's impossible to do. And where we've seen organisations come a cropper in terms of having issues with their supply chains or issues with victims of exploitation and modern slavery, it's because they've ticked the boxes and not gone outside those boxes to understand what to do, and what I call the soft indicators, things that are the soft checks that we need to do, not just the passports and documentation and training and everything else that you need to do. So the standard's really good from that perspective. So in terms of why procurement, it's a really strange environment right now, because I spend a lot of my time trying to tell people we have supply chains, that we need to be responsible for them, that we need to look under the bonnet of what's going on in our supply chains, because organisations can be very, very insular and think about only themselves. What do they do? And Alex very rightly said, I'll explain some of the risk factors in a moment. People tend to think about the risk to my business. And this space, the human rights space, is very much challenging the business status quo, because we do now know that we've got massive footprints and webs of issues in our supply chain that we need to understand how to deal with. Now, when we talked about those issues of 50 million people, there's 50 million people, and Alex said it's probably a dip in the ocean. And as we see the connection with things like climate change, world conflicts, those numbers are going to increase considerably. A large percentage of that, though, is in that forced labour. So whilst people tend to sort of think about the sex trafficking or think about issues around organ harvesting, which in the UK we started to see cases around, the amount of victims that have found themselves in that sort of grey spectrum area of exploitation all the way through to modern slavery within our products is humongous. It's huge. It's around about sort of 28, 29 million. So it's over 50%. And connected to pretty much everything that we have. Now, if you go to the Walk Free Foundation, they actually give you a whole list of all sorts of products that we take for granted every single day, and organisations don't really look at, because they're commodity products. They're products that we trade purely on cost, or we want to make supply chains really sleek in how we deal with those. It's $468 billion worth of product through the G20 companies, through G20 countries every year, that are linked to things that we deal with: our electronics, our textiles, our bricks, our solar panels, coal. I mean, there's a whole long list. It's pretty much in anything and everything that we do. So what we wanted this standard to do is not put a big rubber stamp to say that if you follow this to the key, you're definitely going to be able to say that you have 0 victims of modern slavery in your supply chain. It is not within a business's remit to do that. But a business should be taking responsibility for understanding the impact of the decisions it has, and understand what it's walking into around due diligence, and the supply chain is part of that. Now, one of the things I just want to clarify is that when I'm saying the word supply chain here, I don't mean the people I do a contract with. And we've had some incredibly interesting conversations over the last few years in both standards around this idea of sphere of influence, how deep you go into supply chains, where your role starts as organisations, where government's roles start, where it's an individual's role. And the reality is that if we silo completely, government has a role, business has a role, society has a role. The only way that we will combat this is if we work out how we can work in collaboration with each other within this space. So it's important that part of this is understanding how a business goes from compliance all the way up into areas where it can start to understand how it can change, how it can influence outside of that immediate sphere of tier one of who you contract with into your sub-subs and sub-sub-subs and all the other areas that you go into. So supply chain is that spider approach. Next slide, please. Now, what you can see from a procurement perspective is, and the reason I absolutely love procurement as a vocation and always have done, is that every organisation, regardless of size, has a supply chain. It could be a small business that goes and buys paper for its printer. It could be a large infrastructure company like I work for, or the built environment where we're massive complex projects that have got such complex supply chains to be able to deliver all of the things that we have for our net zero ambitions, for example. So procurement is not just about delivering the right product for the right time for the right price. It's also making sure that we can get a real look into what's going on in our supply chain. And the world of our procurement professionals now is not just about putting tenders out and doing a contract. We have such a good opportunity as procurement professionals, easy for me to say, to engage with suppliers and understand what's already happening within this space. A lot of our suppliers are at the front end and are doing so much. So it's about us connecting the dots, sort of bringing the dominoes in line to be able to create that perfect puzzle. We have buying power. And buying power and leverage is again another thing that we need to really get to grips with. There's elements of it we've included in the standard, but it is also understanding that leverage manifests itself in so many different ways. So procurement and the way that we've built it into the standard is about not one size fitting all. And if we actually look at the government purse, the UK, the US, Europe, all over the world, governments are spending a huge amount of money right now on all sorts of initiatives that we need to be able to ensure that we are considering a very balanced approach. So this is where my sustainability hat comes in. If we're thinking about how we do net zero, do we make sure that we learn from the problems that we had in the past around just sourcing fuel without any consequence, and ensure that we now make sure that our future fuel meets the just transition, meets the idea of how we bring ethical standards alongside the sort of environmental standards that we need to be able to bring in. Next slide, please. So procurement in the standard, I used to work for Action Sustainability, so this was one that they produced a few years ago before I left and moved to Costain. And one of the things that we had a look at quite a lot, and I really juggled with my procurement head, is this idea that when we look at our procurement and our supply chain, we actually segregate due diligence away from the procurement process. And actually, if we look at due diligence that exists within modern slavery, which is identification, prevention, mitigation, and remediation, which are the key things, you can actually overlay all of that into a procurement process. So one of the things that we wanted to do within the standard was make sure that what we weren't trying to do was create another black box of lots of tricks that went off into a department somewhere, because trust me, procurement get asked to do a lot, but we actually interwove it into the organisation sort of governance, into the way they do business as usual. So if you have ESG, this should be very much strong part of your governance requirements. If you're doing sustainable procurement, this methodology that we're bringing into the standard works alongside standards like ISO 2400 because they fed into it. It's about putting in place really good procurement processes. So from the diagram you can see due diligence in modern slavery is about developing your policy. It's about identifying the risk. It's about implementing the strategy, monitoring and improving it, and communicating and reporting. In procurement terms, that is making sure you understand the need, So what is it you are procuring? You're not just buying paper. Are you buying paper that has recycled content, has come from responsibly sourced countries? Are you then embedding those requirements into your sourcing? So it is putting it into that tender eventually, once you've understood what the market can do for you. Then selecting and incentivizing your suppliers. So you want to be able to really understand how your suppliers are doing this, and ensure that you are putting the right element of emphasis in areas where the risk of modern slavery is extensive. And then what I see a huge amount in procurement is this concept of let and forget. So I put it all in a contract, and then I walk on to the next one. And actually, all this fluffy stuff is a bit difficult to deal with, so we won't bother managing that element of the contract. So managing that contract is really, really important. Next slide. So one of the things, as Alex has alluded to, which I think if I was going to take anything, all the procurement piece in there is relatively standard. It's really good practice. You can adopt it for the modern slavery, as we've talked about, relating to things like human rights, to carbon, to anything that you are looking for. It's a very, very standardized and good practice procurement process. I would say the biggest challenge that this is coming from our standards perspective is this concept of risk. And we did toy with the idea of calling it double materiality. I think we're trying to think of calling it something else at the moment, although we're not sure what, because it links in with the ESG concept, that ESG obviously looks at double materiality from a risk perspective to the organization, but an external one from that perspective. And this is quite a new way of thinking about things. So one of the things that we're looking at the moment is raising the profile of what those risk indicators are, making sure organizations are actually considering risk, not just from an organizational perspective, but actually the unintended consequences of some of the decisions that they might potentially be making. So one of the things that we can think about is if you go to market with a procurement requirement, give the market 5 minutes to respond, they have no capability to actually be able to deliver anything for you. Are they going to cut corners? Are they going to go out to a black market? Are they going to go somewhere to be able to just bring people in and give what you want? So challenging our own behaviours from procurement and understanding the risks and unintended consequences on people and on our organisation is an incredibly important part of this standard, and one that we want to make sure we get right, because it underpins pretty much everything that we're doing. And then the final slide is making sure that what we're looking for is good practice. So hopefully, I leave the fancy words to a lot of clever people. I want to make sure from a procurement perspective that this is really pragmatic, it's really useful, it fits in with the way businesses do procurement, or should be doing procurement. That's another interesting conversation. So when we actually go down into the structure within the standard, you will see how we deal with policies, supplier codes of conduct, procurement policies. It's in there alongside the carbon, the nature, included in the social value, whichever elements you want to be able to put it in. That you risk assess your supply chain. You don't do everything for everybody. You focus on where your biggest priorities are, and then you put the right procurement strategy in place. You cannot do this in isolation. I've said that already, but you can't do it in isolation without your supply chain, and your supply chain needs your help. And actually, you probably need to learn from your supply chain. There's a lot of really good practice going on in your supply chain, that just having that conversation around what's good and what they're doing in some of these areas where they're addressing the risk because they're closer to it, is an opportunity lost to help yourselves and individuals. And then bringing it into that governance, making people aware of what you're doing, the monitoring, the auditing. It's not just about auditing, using those audits and making sure that people are being supported. And then if you find something, what do you do? We still don't really yet have enough people who've been very open and honest, and I can totally understand why. But hopefully we will get to a space where there's a recognition that organisations don't mainly deliberately go out their way to actually cause these situations, and that we can learn from them and everything else that's going on in those spaces to make sure we can really make a difference going forward. So that's the procurement element in a very small moment. There's so much more I could go into, but I do strongly recommend Alex's point that he made before, which is go in and have a look at BS 25700. That will give you a really good idea of what we've extracted. It was the base standard that we're using for the ISO, and it's the one that we've dissected and improved. But from a procurement perspective, that's definitely a good place to start, and I'll give you an idea of what's coming around about August, September. So thank you for your time. Any questions? I know we'll probably have some time to have some questions later on, but in the short term, I'll hand over to David.
Helen, thank you. I know it is incredibly complex, and of all the things that I've learned personally, it's coming from the procurement. It is very complex, but you've done a good job putting that in the standard and making it simple and understandable. As you just said, the standard 25700, it is freely downloadable. So somebody's put in the chat here a question about ESG. He's looking for resources, training on human rights, modern slavery, human trafficking that he can share with his stakeholders in the areas of HR, legal, procurement, sustainability, so that they can improve. What's available? Now he's asked for BSI resources that are available to committee members. Frankly, off the top of my head, the most obvious one is 25700. So if you haven't, you just type in Google BS 25700 as a simple form, and then you get the download. And that is a set of good recommendations for all these areas. But to be fair, if you want to go further, you can go further. People like Helen and Alex and other organizations who are committee members, they very much like it when people reach out to them and ask them for their guidance and their advice. Helen, do you have anything to add to that, or Alex?
I would say, I think from an ESG perspective, because what you're looking is environmental, social and governance, the G side, I know that the British standards, BSI, are doing a lot of work around that double materiality and risk. So I would look out for that because it is a big hot topic that links in with ESG. But I would say BS 25700 gives you a really good overview of how you could literally take modern slavery out and apply any other standard that you want, whether it's environment, whether it's biodiversity. The principles and the foundations work really well. And I would also suggest ISO 2400, which is the sustainable procurement one, because again, although it says sustainable procurement on the bucket, it goes right back to organizational purpose and takes you all the way through the sort of foundations before you get to procurement. So, but I'm happy if you want to reach out, I can probably email some more, or I'll get some stuff and send it across to you guys.
Quickly, what's Sean Riles' website on procurement? Just give that a shout out, please.
So Sean McCarthy, the founder of Action Sustainability, and I think I might have some old colleagues on here, have got ISO2400.org, loads and loads of free resources, case studies, blogs, podcasts. Go and have a look at that. There's some amazing resources on there.
Okay, so we're not always all about BSI. We do try to give credit to other people doing very fine work. But do check out the BSI site too, because I know other people have done some videos and training on there that's available to be downloaded. All right, so let's see, Keith, all set. Over to you for you've got, I think I cut into your time, but don't worry, you've got your full 15 minutes or whatever you need to describe your experiences. And thanks again for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you everyone for this afternoon and the opportunity to talk. As Dave said in the beginning, I am a survivor of slavery. I was actually held for roughly about 8 years, from the mid-90s to the early 2000s. In that space, I was held, made to do manual labour, as in people's driveways, patios, any construction work on private properties, basically. And we are made to work in between 12 and 16-hour days. Well, our boss, if you like, would be rolling in the money. We were getting pennies basically for the work we were doing. We were lucky to get £10 a day. The other chap that I was with, that I actually worked with, he was actually captive there for 27 years when he actually got out. I had to get out. Basically, I had to smuggle myself out of Wales, where I was held. And that's another thing I want to touch on. A lot of people think that modern day slavery, or or forced labour, human trafficking. I mean, it happens to there's like a stigma. It happens to foreign people. It happens abroad. It doesn't. It happens on our own doorstep. This is happening right now as we speak. And when I say I started working for them, when I first started, it was almost a nice. They gave me food, gave me somewhere to sleep. Um, at the time, I was homeless. I had money in my pocket, and gradually, they sort of like isolate you from the outside world. Um, I tried to escape um, 3 times prior to my actual escape. I was actually kidnapped and brought back and made to work after then. And then I managed to actually get out of the job, as in get out of Wales. I had to leave everything basically, family, friends. I had to cut off all ties. Luckily, I had a few friends. I've made a few friends over the years, but um, it's been a difficult road. I'm not going to lie. When I was ashamed of myself when I first got out. Why did I let these people do this to me? Why did I fall for this? Why did I, let them treat me like this? And I beat myself up on it, and eventually I sought medical help. After quite a number of years of counselling and therapy, I was eventually strong enough to report my offenders, which they all received hefty custodial sentences. Moving on from that, I'm actually blind. Where I was going blind. I've been going blind all my life. I suffer from a condition called night blindness, which is what it's known as. The correct term is retinitis pigmentosus. In 2017, I had the chance to go on a boat trip, and it was time of reflection. What am I going to do with my life? All I've ever known was building work. That's all I've ever known. And my sight was going, obviously, wasn't safe to be on building sites, wasn't safe to work in supermarkets even. My sight was getting that bad. And I thought to myself, what can I do? And it was almost like an epiphany where I thought, if I can just stop one trafficker, stop one person from being trafficked, I've done a good job. I met a charity based in Guernsey, and one of the charity owners was a lecturer at Nottingham University in the Rights Lab. Kevin Bales, I believe Alex may know him, who put me on to a lady, Mindang, which is a doctor now, Dr. Mindang, and she created Survival Alliance UK in 2018. Now, I was one of the first members to join this group, and to be honest, it was good in a way because we all had something in common. We all had something that had happened to us sometime in our life. But we are getting better. And the idea of Survivors Alliance was to actually put awareness out to the public of what is actually going on. And then I had the opportunity to join the British Standards Institute. To be honest with you, at first I didn't think I would be up for the job. A, because of my eyesight, and B, I knew nothing about the British Standards Institute. But since joining the British Standards, it's being a committee member, it's educated me, it's empowered me to do more. I also work on my bio. I've also got other things, the MOS, COS, which is a research advisory board where it's just survivors of human trafficking, forced labour, and we advise the government basically what should be done in first responding. We've done a case on the site is on my bio, and it's really interesting on there. It's just survivors giving their stories, and it's work. And then I was asked to by Dave, would I like to work on the 37-200? Now, I was always wanted to go worldwide. There was only one way for the 25-700. It was a base plate to go worldwide, and this is what we've done. And I think hearing things from a survivor's point of view, I'm hopefully it resonates with people, and especially with professionals wherever in the world. I am the first survivor to actually work with the British Standards and ISO. And like I said, I have learned a lot, and I hope the people I work with have learned a lot. Where standards, we need standards. Slavery now has been going on for thousands of years. Thousands. Now, we need to make a stand on slavery. We need to stop slavery, and it's time for us to actually stop the big cat. The cat's getting fatter, and do you know what I mean? Concentrate on concentrating on the individuals. For instance, if your business is found to be using some sort of forced labour, Monday slavery, human trafficking, what should you do? Do you know what I mean? First instinct would be probably run a mile, but there's ways and means to go about things. Unfortunately, slavery is so big now. 50 million. That's probably just a drop in the ocean to what is really out there. Yeah, it's just been an adventure for me, and just a learning process for me to work with the British Standards and with ISO, and to meet some really interesting people. I think I'd like to wrap it up there, and I'll
Thanks,
pass it
Steve.
on to Duncan.
Hey, before you pass it on to Duncan, because
Yeah.
just one thing that does crop up is the
hmm
subtlety of becoming enslaved. So you mentioned that at first you were homeless, and at first that you money in your pocket, you had a place to stay, and I see that resonates with some of the things we've heard for what's happened for other people. Was it a sort of a subtle thing? You weren't just enslaved as such. Was it at first
No,
an all right
it was a
situation?
very, very subtle, gradual um, manipulation, if you like,
Hmm.
into coercing myself and the other fella into doing what they would want to do. I mean, and like I said, Sundays we were working 60-hour days. I can recall in one incident over the space of about a week. The person we were actually working for, they made, without paying any tax on this as well, over £100,000 profit, and that was after paying for materials. And this was quite late in me being there, and this is when I was like, I got to get out of this. And that's probably when I started to try and escape, basically. But when traffickers, when they got a hold on you, it's very difficult to escape it. Unless there's any sort of prosecution, um, it's very, very difficult to escape the grasp of the traffickers.
When you were
Where, sorry,
sorry,
Tom.
when you started at BSI, you obviously knew from Survivor Alliance that they gave you the connection. But when you were working, being forced to labor, and I mean, a lot of people don't know the definition of modern slavery. It includes, forced
Hmm.
labor. Well, they often think it's just human trafficking or, um, you know, having people work for various things against their will. But it's debt
Hmm.
bondage and it's forced marriages, and the subtlety comes across there. When you were doing when that was happening to you, were you aware of it? Were you aware that this is
Um,
wrong?
at, at first, I wasn't, and then I became aware of it, and it was like when I became aware of it, that's when my trafficker ramped up um, violence, threats of violence, and it wouldn't be just my trafficker; it would be his wife if he wasn't there. For instance, if we would never have a day off. Um, we would have to do if we weren't working on a job, we would have to do something around his property, whether it be hammering down with rain, snow, sun, whatever it was.
Mhm.
And we used to get threats from the wife. I mean, it's almost like um, as you would say a child, you wait till your dad gets home, or you wait till I tell your dad. Do you know what I mean? And that's the
Mhm.
way they come across is the threat. And like the threat, just the threats of violence was almost enough to just not push them to be violent towards you.
Mhm. Keith, you had the satisfaction, if there is any kind of real satisfaction out of this, but to see your enslavers, I guess is the term, prosecuted.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, that must have
yeah.
been a good day
Oh, yeah. It
for
was
you.
it was a good day. It was a
Mhm.
good day. Don't get me wrong, but
Mhm.
leading up to it, the case was opened in 2013. It took 3 years to get the case to Crown Court.
Okay.
That's how big the case was. Um, like to be in court, although they were sat behind screens, to be in court and to actually be able to hear them, that was quite scary in itself. But then to hear the sentences that they were given, it's like the main person, he was given 14 years and 13 and a half concurrent. The main trafficker, there was four members of the family altogether. And ranging down to 2.5 years for the one of them. So to have that satisfaction, I mean, yes, it is satisfying to have that time. I mean, I got a conviction, but it's not. I mean, it's not a day of rejoice in my diary.
Exactly. And what cost? You
It,
suffered so much that was almost like a minimal amount of justice that could be
hmm
very.
hmm
Listen, thank
like it's like their dates of like sentencing that every year it almost creeps up on me. Do you know what I mean? And I think that resonates with most survivors of slavery. It's it's not just the what's happened to you when you were being enslaved. It's afterwards. I mean, the mental health afterwards. Luckily, I mean, I've become strong enough to actually speak about it and be open about it. And I feel if I don't speak,
you.
there's one less voice trying to solve a problem, let's say.
You always said that, Keith. You said, I remember when we first met, you said if I can help one person, as you just said a second ago. So no doubt you're helping other people by making them aware and recounting your experience.
Hmm
And thank you. Thank you very much for being open enough and brave enough to do that. Appreciate it.
Well,
Again.
thank you, Dave.
All right. Terrific. Now, in terms of the next speaker, Duncan Jepson with Preveni. Duncan, as we say, is a director of strategy and operation, but has a lot of experience as a prosecutor. So without further delay, sorry that we just took those questions as and when we could, Duncan. So, but you got your full 15 minutes. So over to you.
Thank you, Dave. And it was very important to hear from Keith just then. So I hope everybody was able to take a sense of the damage that is done by allowing modern slavery and exploitation to happen. So briefly, my background: I was, unfortunately, Dave said I was not a prosecutor. I was a corporate counsel across Asia Pacific, but very quickly in the 90s, I did purchasing and supply procurement from China to the UK between 93 to about 98, and at that time also then became a corporate finance lawyer and worked in private practice, and eventually became the general counsel and head of compliance at ING's investment business across Asia Pacific, and then at another US firm. And during that time, I was interested in the way that one of the aspects of my responsibility was money laundering and anti-corruption. Did quite a lot of internal investigations across Asia Pacific in that. And I was intrigued how all of the things that we did in compliance and internal investigation could be used in information handling about supply chains. This is of money as opposed to products. Could be used to combat things like human trafficking, wildlife trafficking. This is in the sort of late 2000s. And so I built an NGO called Liberty Shared during the late 2000s and eventually closed it about 2 or 3 years ago. And we did a lot of investigations, so responsible for the trade ban of palm oil coming into the US, of sugar coming from the Dominican Republic, and a couple of other investigations, which I'll briefly talk about to give you an idea about the risks to your business, your organization, and yourself if you then are putting people at risk or are actually exploiting individuals in your supply chain and you are benefiting from it. And that's really where I want to start. So if you have the next slide, please. So the first thing you got to remember is that a lot of where we started back, if you go back to the 1990s, most people would think about obviously murder, rape, sexual as crimes, but when they thought about exploitation of workers in a supply chain, they saw that as a business ethics issue. And so it became a part of CSR, business sustainability, but fundamentally exploiting somebody for benefit is a crime, and it's as simple as that. And crimes in different countries, as with all legislation, are set out differently. But to coerce somebody for your benefit through the threat of violence, through actual violence, and that might also be sexual violence, to steal from them, to take their wages, which is ultimately not paying them. And whilst that is a contractual breach, it is also theft. So these are all crimes, and as you add them up, whether you're coercing them, whether they're being retained in a place, being held against their will, the activities that take place in modern slavery, wage theft, being held physically, being kidnapped, as Keith said, these are all criminal activities. So even if you sit down and say, well, is this a modern slavery crime? Depending on the legislation in that country, there are a lot of other crimes that are being committed at the same time. But here we'll just focus on modern slavery, but have in the back of your mind or the front of it that the nature of coercing somebody involves a lot of other criminal activities. So next slide, please. Next, thank you. So let's just look at, yeah, great. So let's just look at one of the crimes. So we're going to look at the US criminal code. The US has a number of crimes on its books relating to forced labor and human trafficking. They don't use the term modern slavery in the US. So, and for legal reasons, for the law. This is the statute, the law for forced labor. I just want to bring your attention to. So this is about knowingly provides or obtains forced labor by any combination of means of force, threats of force, physical restraint, threats of physical restraint to another person, serious harm or threat of serious harm, threat of abuse by the legal process. So, for example, someone does not have the right documentation, threatening to report them to immigration, for example. If you've taken their papers in particular, that threat of use of the force of law against them is also a means of coercion. And then being involved in a scheme or a plan or a pattern intended to do that. So a supply chain is definitely a scheme and a plan because you're deliberately creating it in order to buy something. So, you know, for modern slavery in the supply chains is very much falls within this example of the US law and does in many others. So when you're running supply chains, when you're buying things, remind yourself it is a crime. The crime is fairly well developed. It's not that these crimes haven't touched upon the things that are being done in supply chains. And so the second part of the law is also pretty important. Can we move to the next slide, please? So you might say, well, okay, fine, but I'm not actually involved. It's 3 tiers down, 4 tiers down. I don't want it in there, but I'm not committing the crime. The crime obviously is not that simplistic. So anybody who benefits from from exploiting somebody is also committing a crime. And that dovetails very much with what is money laundering, obviously. If you handle the proceeds of a crime, then that is whether it's cash or cash in kind or in kind, that is a crime too. And the federal law in the US captures that part of it. So it says whoever knowingly benefits financially or by receiving anything of value from participation in a venture which has engaged in providing or obtaining labor or services by any means described in subsection A, the one we just looked at, knowing or in reckless disregard of the fact that the venture has engaged in providing or obtaining labor or services by any such means shall be punished in according to subsection D, and we'll have a look at that. So you might know you've been doing this, but you might also have not been bothered. You don't want to check, don't want to gather the information, do due diligence, being reckless, in other words. You're involved in the supply chain. This might expose you to criminal liability and then ultimately possibly criminal prosecution. But as we said, this has been an ethical issue. I mean, I spoke to I used to write for the Purchasing and Supply Chain magazine back in the 90s, and I remember going to a number of conferences, and you'd ask people whether they thought this was a crime, and they'd be like, "No, I'm pretty sure this is an ethical issue." It is. I came from the world of finance and handling money which is money laundering from criminal activities, which includes human trafficking, is a crime and is taken seriously as so. In the procurement world, it hasn't really been fully absorbed, but it's important that starts to happen, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Can we go to the next slide, please? So let's just, I mean, Alex and Helen have already talked about this. But the numbers are in a way the numbers seem large, 236 billion, but we're in a multi-trillion economy, so this is a small number in materiality. But what I want to remind you is that the way this is calculated, so this $236 billion number you'll see in virtually every paragraph that has ever been written on a report focused to business, $236 billion in illegal profits. But this is based on a number that is really just said, here are 10,000 dollars that are earned by each victim. And therefore, we're just going to do a sort of calculation based off that. If you look at, for instance, some of you will be familiar with the efforts in the US Customs and Border Protection Office of Trade relating to banning goods coming in. They banned for a period of time, and I was very much involved in this, they banned a lot of goods coming from Malaysia, several palm oil companies, rubber glove companies, and these employed tens of thousands of people. Their profits were in the billions of dollars alone. So this number is a bit misleading in that when you start to look at the businesses that have been creating huge amounts of profits off the backs of people in forced labor, those numbers start to add up pretty quickly to billions of dollars, let alone just in one or two countries. And if we start to talk about, as I think Helen referred to, the numbers of the products that are listed by Walk Free or in the US Department of Labor's ILAB report, there are a number of adverse lists around which products are made with forced labor in some cases. Then those numbers start to add up to a lot more than simply $250 billion. So have in mind that these numbers are low, and the possibility of being engaged with and buying from supply chains with forced labor is much higher. The issue that is causing us to think in a kind of positive way, in a way that, okay, well, it won't involve me, is because there have been very few prosecutions so far around against companies and against individuals in companies. So have in mind that these numbers that are posted, and often you'll see in reports, are very low estimations. And when you actually start thinking about the numbers of industries that have been hit and the size of those companies, the actual amounts of revenue that relate to forced labor stack up much quicker, much higher than the 236 billion. You go to the next slide, please. So let's think about what happens. The definition here of forced labor. They're just using a definition which is abuse or threatened abuse of law of the legal process. Means the use of threatened use of law or legal process, whether administrative law, civil, criminal. And when you're talking about workers, as Keith described, he is exploited and being coerced in many different ways. There is no payments being made to him that should be for a day's work. There is no contract. He's being held against his will. He's being psychologically and physically coerced to do things that he doesn't wish to do. And so there's a constant threat of abuse in different ways. And this, obviously, if we think about this in a reminder of the Keith's situation, but then you think about this in large factory situations, wherever that might be, then it becomes engineered and systemic that workers on plantations, for example, and large manufacturing processes, governance has been created to put these people in this situation. The results of a system are the design of that system. So it isn't the case that you can say, oh, something's gone wrong. If that's what's occurring, it's because the system, unfortunately, is designed to do that. And that is we should all know, as people who run organizations, is because the governance, the internal controls, the risk management, the 3 lines of defense have all been designed basically to allow people to be abused. And that, again, talks to things that are a plan, a venture, an effort to achieve that. So when you're working supply chains and you're thinking, okay, well, I'm working with these companies, we've all been working in them for in this industry for a long time, I think they're going to be reliable. The problem is that reliability also speaks to systemic structures that are built to abuse people and actually get those prices and cost structures that you want to rely on. So it's systemic, it's inherent. Unfortunately, we have to talk about things like colonialism and so forth, because a lot of the production when you find it in manufacturing and in agriculture, comes from production that occurred basically 200 years ago. Now, that's history, unfortunately. It's not about whose fault it is, although that is an important discussion. But the point is, when you go to production systems that exist in, say, sugar, rubber, palm oil, they are same production systems as have existed for several hundred years, and they have not changed. How do we know they've not changed? And anyone who works in a corporation on this call will know that to change production systems and structures requires a huge amount of money. As someone who used to do a lot of M&A and restructuring, you need tens of millions of dollars to rebuild a company's internal governance structure. It cannot be done overnight. Now, if you don't see that kind of investment over years to change the way people are treated, tens of thousands, then it probably means the production is probably governed similarly to how it has been for many, many years that the company existed, which for in industrial agriculture can be a long time, especially in commodities like sugar, again, palm oil, coffee, rubber, tea, and so forth, which is why we keep seeing it reoccur. They haven't fundamentally been restructured. So if you go to the next slide, please. So what do we learn here? We learn a couple of things. Firstly, it's a crime. It applies to the organization and it applies to you as individuals running supply chains. In the US, it is not more than a 20-year sentence. And that's important to remember is that, white collar people, having been one myself, often they don't think about it themselves as engaging in criminal activities, or it's a kind of, well, as I always learned when I did investigation and you interview people who have committed crimes, the first thing they'll tell you is, but everybody else does it. I was speaking to my old colleague at so-and-so company and they do exactly the same thing. Unfortunately, that doesn't make it any less criminal. And so the law in the US stipulates a 20-year sentence, and you will find sentencing actually in most countries for this crime. It is both organizational and individual. So you have to think about your own risk. If you're involved in this or it's happening, then you need to be courageous and you need to be brave and you need to say, we need to stop this. And actually, you need to report it to the police, which is a much harder thing to do. Having been a whistleblower on not on this kind of thing, but on financial crime, I can tell you it's hard to be a whistleblower. But what I could say is that unfortunately it is necessary, and particularly in this situation. Do you want to go to the next slide, please? So let's just look at the prosecutions. Why do we not think of this as a crime? Well, the reality is the prosecutions on one side are incredibly low. And this is taken from the State Department, the US State Department's report on human trafficking. And you can see that actually it's sort of the middle, the third column along. Number of convictions annually for human trafficking, modern slavery is never really more than about 9,500, but hovers around a sort of 7,000 or 8,000 average. The convictions in law enforcement is poor, and so we don't think of it as a crime because there are very few actual cases. So the next slide, please. So this is one that I did. It was an investigation into Goodyear's subsidiaries. I had at that point in time a close sort of working collaborative relationship with Homeland Security Investigations, and through them the Department of Justice in the US. And one of my aims was to bring the first criminal case against an organization, a large multinational company, and could that be done? Ended up working on it in relation to a subsidiary of Goodyear. Federal investigators became involved, and eventually that turned into an actual criminal investigation. Unfortunately, what I do know is that this was the first criminal investigation that ever happened, at least in a Fortune 500 company. Do you want to go to the next slide, please? Ultimately, it led to a large payment to the workers, mostly existing workers, and that's one of the issues, because only a certain number of previous workers could be identified, or located rather. A lot of them could be identified, but we couldn't locate them. So a payment was made through their lawyer, which was good. Some changes were made to the factory, but now they're going to have to pay people at the right kind of level, and that put a lot of financial burden on the factory. The factory, after 50 odd years, was had to close. In truth, the jobs were then moved to other parts of Asia. Now, I can't say exactly the exact reasons why it closed, but this followed up fairly soon after the case was case was concluded. We did not get to a prosecution, but there was a strong attempt by investigators and attorneys to try and do that, and that will come. Next slide, please. So how do I know that this was the first ever case? So I actually, along with the federal investigators and the attorneys, I actually won on a kind of a certificate of merit, an award from the World Customs Organization. I think it was about 2 years ago. And in the award, it actually says, which was kind of news to me to have this formally written, was this investigation into Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company operating in Malaysia as Goodyear Malaysia Berhad was the first of its kind to address forced labor in the global supply chain of a Fortune 500 company, and the rest of it. So what I want to add is that don't sort of believe the false negative, because in a sense you've not heard of any cases. It doesn't mean that there aren't going to be them and that there can't be them, and it doesn't mean because you've not heard of any that it doesn't happen and that you're not liable. The importance of having the standard is that the standard should remind you, firstly, it's a crime. Secondly, which is your own liability. Secondly, which is highly important, is the kind of abuse that people are being put through, and their abuse is, of course, the central issue we're trying to resolve here. The standard also starts to tell you what you need to do. It is not going to be a defense against a crime, as doing due diligence and following the UN general principles is not going to be a defense, but you need to make sure that you have done the right due diligence to at least say that you can raise your hand as soon as possible in order to solve this issue and therefore not be charged. So have that in mind, is that as well as the discussion around modern slavery, as well as the increased discussion around modern slavery, the increased issues around due diligence, have in mind that this is a crime and it is being increasingly investigated, and it will be prosecuted at some point, and you do not want to be the people and the organization as a target. So I will finish there. Time has run out, and
Thank you,
happy to take
Duncan.
any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Listen, there were a lot of questions, actually. So Richard Jones, Lisa Khan, Isabel Kelly, Anita Punwani, thank you so much for your questions, but it might be down to the facilitator that I botched it up, but we don't have time for those. But interesting, we kind of thought that would be the case because the speakers are very, very good. What we're going to do is we're going to have another one of these webinars on the 10th of September. And at that point, we will allow, maybe half of the session to allow for questions and open discussion amongst people. So if I can close by thanking the speakers again, very much, Helen, Duncan, Keith, Alex, thank you very much. And for everybody who's joined us today, as I say, this will be available. I hope you join us on the 10th. And just a last pitch that BSI is always looking for committee members. So if you would like to become a committee member and you think, oh, I couldn't possibly, you probably can, actually. And we're very grateful for your voluntary participation. So appreciate that. I think I'll close it at that. Thanks, everyone.